Welcome, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker. Once again, we're together, and I'm going to start with you since we're in the Senate, Mr. President. Governor Scott has been traveling the state, getting input into how to cut taxes by $500 million, and he's received a lot of input. And Mr. President, you have said that tax cuts should not be done in dribs and drabs, but how are you and the Senate approaching tax cuts?
Well, first of all, I commend the governor for taking the position that the people of Florida ought to have more of their own money kept in their own pockets. That's the best kind of economic stimulus you can have, is to let people keep their own earnings or more of them. And I'm glad that he's listened, as the Speaker and I have, as we've moved around the state, to ideas that people have. You know, there are things that you can do with the tax code that maybe look good inside this chamber. They might look good inside Tallahassee, but they don't have a real impact on people's lives. What I mean about not doing dribs and drabs is to make sure that whatever kind of tax or fee cut we do affects the lives of working people in Florida. We've cut taxes on big businesses and small businesses and medium-sized businesses, and I voted for all those tax cuts, and they were the right thing to do. But now it's time to lift the burden, if we can, off people who work for a living, who drive their cars and their trucks to school and to their jobs. I think that's the kind of tax and fee cutting we ought to do.
Mr. Speaker?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, first of all, again, commend the governor for setting a marker, $500 million. It's a bold marker that's out there. I can't remember the last time the legislature has passed a bill of that significance in the budget that has reduced the tax burden at that level. So it's a great thing. And the good news is we're not arguing over whether or not we should cut taxes. The debate that is going to take place here in both the House and in the Senate is, what taxes do we cut? How do we bring the most relief to everyday Floridians? And I agree with the Senate President. I think that, you know, this is not the year for the big business tax cuts or the pro-business tax cuts, although we'll probably do some. What we want to find a way is to target the everyday person, what kind of paycheck Floridian as opposed to the portfolio for Floridian. And there are people who are struggling to make paychecks, and we think putting a little bit of money into their pocket could go a long way.
Is the $500 million marker, is that the right number, or have you all gotten far enough down the road to determine what the revenue picture looks like yet?
Well, we're going to have 2 more revenue estimating conferences before we have to pour cement around the budget. And, you know, with the dynamic nature of the economy right now, with the uncertain nature of the economy, thanks, frankly, to our friends in Washington, who don't seem to be able to pass a Mother's Day resolution. Well, that's not true. They passed one 417 to 413 the other day after 12 hours of debate. But because of the uncertainty in Washington, I think we need to be cautious about whatever we do in budgeting, in tax cuts as well as in appropriations. So we're certainly going to shoot for as much of a tax cut or a fee cut as we can do. As the Speaker has said, when you talk about tax cuts, you get a warm welcome in the Florida House, and I think in the Florida Senate as well. But we want to get a little bit closer to reality, to what we know the real numbers are going to be, before we settle on everything and specifically what we can do.
All right, Mr. Speaker, last year, you adamantly opposed expanding the Medicaid program to meet federal guidelines and accepting the money. And, you know, hindsight's 20/20, but you seem to have foresight. Now, I guess I want to ask you, as we go into the 2014 session, where is public policy going to go in terms of covering the uninsured in Florida at this point?
Well, I would say the first thing, we recognize that there are a significant amount of Floridians that don't have insurance. That's not a good thing. We're not proud of that as a state. I'm not proud of that as the Speaker of the House. I think where the rub is the difference in how we think that we solve that problem. The Obamacare expansion is throwing a lot of money at a problem where they basically bring you into it as a bait and switch. They pay for it for a few years, and then at some point the state's going to figure out how to pay for a significant portion of it on its own. That could be a $2 or $3 billion fiscal note on the state of Florida and on the taxpayers. Our thought is, how can we create a free market approach? How can we create an approach that lifts people up creates social upward mobility for folks as opposed to bringing in a flawed system that is Medicaid. The Senate worked on what I thought was a great proposal in the sense that they got very innovative and tried to find a way to take the funds from the feds and put them into free market plans. Frankly, Joe Negron worked really hard on that. I thought that it was very innovative. The problem we had with it was the federal funds and not knowing how to sustain those federal funds long term. So our position is we're going to continue to work with my friends in the Senate. Senate President Gaetz and I think philosophically come from the same place. And we're going to work with them to try to solve this problem with a free market approach, but at the same time with the recognition that those federal funds that are being promised are coming from a federal government that has been shut down here just recently, and also is in charge of rolling out an exchange process that has been one of the biggest debacles that in American government history. So I just think we need to take our breath, or catch our breath, take our time, and make sure that we're diligent in solving this real problem that is the uninsured that in the state of Florida.
Is there any way, Mr. President, that Florida can, on its own, with its own resources, set up some way, some fund to expand care for the uninsured?
I think there are some ways. The House of Representatives, or Representative Corcoran, had a proposal last year that was in its way very innovative and I think relied upon choice and free market conditions and people being able to have more control over their own health care. I think that's a good starting point for us to sit down and talk again about finding common ground. But let's remember this. A year ago, when Speaker Weatherford said, we're suspicious of the federal government being willing and able to keep its promises, a lot of people said, how could you possibly take that position? Now he looks like he had the gift of prophecy because, ask the 32,000 Floridians who were furloughed and who still are on furlough part of the time because of the federal government's inability to even come together on the basics of a budget outline. And when the President and the Congress are in that kind of paralysis and can't pay their own bills, can't maintain their commitments to people in the military and people who are serving the military through defense contracts, it seems like Speaker Weatherford was had the gift of prophecy to say, let's see how some of these other states are doing. Let's see how Obamacare expansion really rolls out. Before Florida takes a plunge that could cost the people of Florida billions of dollars and also put 1 out of every 4 Floridians into a dependency on Medicaid circumstance that would be uncertain in terms of its ability to keep its promises. So frankly, I'm pleased that we took the action we did, which was to look at options, to be steady about this and not plunge into an Obamacare expansion. Thank goodness we didn't. Because look at all the people who depended on the federal government to keep its promises, and now you can't even get on the exchange.
Mr. President, the Democratic leader of the Senate, Mr. Senator Smith, has been calling for you to appoint a select committee to review in depth the Stand Your Ground law. And I think you have been saying no to that, but there has been activity in the Senate reviewing the Stand Your Ground law. Bring us up to date on the status of Stand Your Ground in the Senate, and I'm going to use the same thing for the House, Mr. Speaker.
Well, Leader Smith asked for a select committee because he said he wanted a select committee to report out a bill that would change Stand Your Ground. And in the Senate, select committees don't report out legislation. So he was asking for something in a select committee that wouldn't have given him what he really wanted, which was a chance to debate a bill. What did happen was that Senator Lee, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, took up Senator Smith and a bill that would change Stand Your Ground. They debated it, they discussed it. If the bill is going to be heard again, it would be heard in the Criminal Justice Committee, chaired by Senator Evers. So I think those who want to have a discussion about Stand Your Ground in the Senate, we've provided that venue, and I would say that Leader Smith has acted very responsibly and thoughtfully and civilly in preparing and undergoing that debate. But I oppose material changes in the Stand Your Ground law. That law was passed in this Senate and in that House of Representatives by a strong bipartisan majority. Rod Smith, who until recently was the Democratic chairman for the state of Florida, was one of the co-sponsors of the bill in the Senate. So I stand with Rod Smith and others who thought that this law was the right thing to do to make sure that Floridians could defend themselves if they or their loved ones were in imminent danger. I think there's nothing wrong with that law. I think it's a good law. It's constitutional. But those who wanted to have a discussion and debate about it in the Senate have had that chance.
Mr. Speaker.
I feel very similar to the Senate President on this, and we're today actually going to be having a debate in the Florida House on Stand Your Ground. There was a bill that was filed that we wanted to repeal. In fact, there was a movement within the Florida House. In fact, there were people who camped out here for about 30 or 60 days, I think, Mr. President, and they were calling on a repeal of Stand Your Ground. And I gave my word that we would hold a committee hearing in the Criminal Justice Committee. It's chaired by a guy I think you know pretty well by the name of Matt Gaetz. And Matt will be holding a hearing, and they will get the opportunity to have that bill heard and debated. And we're going to have a very thoughtful discussion about the Stand Your Ground law. But when it comes to the actual policy of the bill, and when it comes to the policy of Stand Your Ground, there have been some tragedies in Florida that are inexplainable. There have been some tragedies in Florida where a lot of fingers have been pointed and directed at the Stand Your Ground law as the culprit. But the truth is, we don't know what happened in some of those situations. But what we do know is that an individual who is in a position where their life is being threatened should have the ability to defend themselves in the United States of America. That's what our Constitution says. That's what I believe the state of Florida's law says. And I believe that's what Stand Your Ground does. And I support that. And I believe that the debate will be thorough, and it will, everyone will have an opportunity to have their voice heard. But on a personal level, I wouldn't change Stand Your Ground.
All right, let's go to break.
From the very beginning, women veterans have worn many hats. Army berets and nurses' caps, aviator helmets, and Morse code headgear. The hats reflect the roles they played, from nurses and radio operators to pilots and mechanics. At the same time they wore those hats, America's women veterans also wore the hats of wives and mothers. Mother, sister, daughter, veteran. Serving their families, defending our country. We honor all the hats you wear.
When our country called on us to serve, we served with honor. Whether by land, sea, or air, we carried the flag of freedom. Nearly 450,000 strong, Vietnam veterans returned home to contribute to Florida's economy and way of life. Now the Sunshine State honors our service. Access the many benefits and services you've earned by visiting floridavets.org. The Florida Department of Veterans Affairs, honoring those who served us.